Everyone is going to die eventually. Everyone. Everyone you know and love, every nation, religion, philosophy, and human thought that has ever come into existence will eventually die. No one can really say what happens after you die, but we spend a lot of time speculating. No matter what happens, it is still inevitable. Now, you can say that death really isn't the end, that it's just one step towards the collective progression of nature, or that death really shouldn't matter to those of us living at all, that life is more about the journey than the destination. But the unknowable, mysterious, and inevitable blackness of death is one hell of a mental obstacle to overcome. And overcoming it is what Dark Souls is all about. Dark Souls is a game that exists between extremes. It doesn't fit any easy genre or stereotypes, and while it was designed like a very hardcore niche release for a very small market, it sold over 2 million copies. It turns out that it was a mainstream success. It appealed to people across multiple audiences, and its design is actually more accessible than it lets on. Dark Souls exists in a kind of game design limbo. Its undead characters exist somewhere between life and death. It's a hack-and-slash action game and also a stat-based dice-rolling RPG. The art behind its visual design lies somewhere between east and west. Its level design and difficulty evoke the feelings of retro games, but it's a cutting-edge concept. And it's neither a single-player or a multiplayer game. It's an unconventional fusion of the two. But Dark Souls is not famous for being ambiguous. It's famous for being hard, and it was deliberately designed that way. Though many nuances of its design evoke older games, like the slow, delayed attacks or the cryptic puzzles, its designers weren't necessarily adhering to an old-school design philosophy. There isn't anything romantic, noble, or passionate about old video games being hard. Instead, the difficulty of games in the 80s and early 90s had a whole lot to do with technical hurdles that the designers of Dark Souls would have wanted to avoid. Before the advent of save states, high difficulty was a way to pad out length. An inexperienced player can easily play through Contra on an emulator nowadays in a couple of hours if they just quick save a lot. But back in the day, it would feel like you got a lot more value out of the game if it took you months to beat instead. After all, you could only make 3 mistakes before having to go through all those hours all over again. It was also a way to flesh out the early storytelling techniques of gaming back when it was young, back when games didn't have enough storage space to tell a story with words. Much of your main character's accomplishments, stakes, motivations, and outcomes were shared with the player by means of how hard they were to achieve. Victories would feel meaningful simply because difficulty was high. And perhaps the most practical reason older video games were more difficult is because that was an outcome of transitioning from arcade machines to home consoles. Unexpected difficulty spikes were quarter bait. They were a tempting reason for the player to give the game another shot after failing. And this was a common design aspect that home consoles inherited, usually by substituting player lives in place of their quarters. But home consoles have made arcades obsolete, so save states have made life counts obsolete. Most of a game's drama is now performed inside the game by actors, rather than outside the game by the player. And even though we can save our progress through games, we also want our $60 purchases to last more than a couple hours long. So nowadays, players face a few really interesting contradictions when it comes to difficulty. Whatever the victory condition of a game is, we generally want to achieve that. But we also don't want to win too easily. Failure adds nuance to an experience, and just as ever, it also adds drama and excitement. It gives you stakes, it gives you a shared experience with your character, and it can also give the player a reason to assess themselves, or experiment with something new. Failure doesn't just make success feel better, it also makes the process of getting there more interesting. And that is where Dark Souls comes in, as a modern-day video game exploration of failure. Now, according to one psychological researcher from the 60s named Harold Kelly, people tend to attribute outcomes of events in 3 different ways. They'll attribute it to personal traits like skills or dispositions, or they'll attribute it to the entity's traits, or they'll attribute it to abstract or unmeasurable circumstances like luck. Chances are that while playing through Dark Souls, you made some very passionate explanations for yourself that attributed your deaths to all 3 of those causes. And isn't it ironic that a game about exploring failure became such a success? Dark Souls may remind you of how hard games used to be, but Dark Souls is hard for very different reasons. It was deliberately designed to not just feel vintage, but to be harder than what players have always been used to, even the ones who have been around since the 80s. Nothing about its level of difficulty is conventional or normal. And that was the game's primary feature. They wanted it hard. That was the point. Prepare to die was its marketing slogan after all, and sure enough, that's what you spend an awful lot of time doing in this game. It was marketed as being difficult from the beginning, and you'd think that would have turned a lot of people off, but it didn't. And the success of Dark Souls might have a lot to do with how difficult it was marketed to be, or how difficult it appears to be versus how difficult it becomes later on. The entire experience is designed to overwhelm the player with the presumption of hardship and suffering. Even the marketing materials do this before you turn it on. The main menu looks and sounds more like a grimy survival horror game than a fantasy RPG, and the first cutscene features your character that you spent so much time creating cowering in a prison cell. And for some reason, you're a dried-up, desiccated corpse. And then another dried-up, desiccated corpse slams on the ground and sets even more of a tone right from the get-go. Dark Souls is an intimidating game to even look at for a lot of reasons. Its environments evoke danger, loneliness, and solitude. They are vast and empty, they're eroded and decaying. They're full of pitfalls, narrow cliffs, and catwalks. They're full of monsters who attack on sight. There are very few friendly characters, and even they can barely be considered friendly. These environments are also dark. The game stays true to its name. There are some areas that seem like they're trading off ambient lighting values for an ambient darkness value. You can see the line in the ground where this happens. Darkness is a relevant antagonist in the story, and it's also used for gameplay purposes in one of the later levels. These environments are also morbid. The level designers of Dark Souls stuck to 3 central themes that these places would build on top of: high fantasy, death and darkness, and purgatory and flames. You descend from the high fantasy castles of the undead parish into the purgatory and flames of the demon ruins, with the death and darkness of neglected catacombs filling up what's in between. And last but not least, these environments are quiet. There's no background music in Dark Souls, only during boss fights and 2 very odd locations. For 90% of the game, you'll just be listening to your own ambient footsteps and the breathing monsters nearby. There's no artificiality to it, nothing to distract you or misrepresent the mood of these places. They're designed to intimidate, they're designed to keep you on your toes, to encourage you to move slowly and cautiously. That's because death comes quickly in Dark Souls, and it can have very dire consequences. Combat has high stakes for both you and your enemies, and every death will cost you the resources you spend on your way there. The bloodstains are a huge feature that just exist only to reassure you that other players are having it as bad as you are. And then there are the bosses, which are just as intimidating in a very different way. Most of the bosses in this game are so big that you can only see their feet. Their footsteps shake the screen, they're so loud and bass-heavy that they'll barely make it through your speakers. They deal and take a whole lot more damage than your regular foes, and their size makes them harder to approach. And again, they're even more of an event because they have the uncommon background music tracks. But the process of figuring out how to overcome the bosses in Dark Souls is kind of a microcosm to how you figure out how to overcome the whole game. As large and terrifying as those bosses may be, they'll usually be moving very slowly. They telegraph their next move with a slow, obvious animation before the actual attack. This is something they all do, it's a constant across the whole game, and even the faster bosses still follow that rule. They also have blind spots that you can easily exploit, usually in unexpected places, sometimes right in front of them. You have to be experienced and also willing to experiment to get through them, and that is the very basic, easily explainable, and totally rational strategy for overcoming the difficulty of the whole game. Like learning any skill in life, this stuff doesn't get any easier the longer you do it, you just figure out nuances and tricks. And Dark Souls is very cleverly designed to help you learn how to figure out those nuances. Overcoming that difficulty is like walking a psychological tightrope between temptation and patience. You have to slow the mental speed of your thoughts down to meet the slow speed of its combat, while still being sharp enough to know what openings you should exploit. Despite the show it puts on, the core rules of combat in Dark Souls are about as classic and simple as video game combat can get. All attacks have a wind-up and cooldown period, and those moments leave combatants vulnerable to counterattack. So the whole game is about exploiting those vulnerable periods. You dodge or block an enemy's attack, then use your own wind-up time during their cooldown time, and there you go. If your attack triggers a stun animation, then you can catch them in a stun lock, and you're pretty much done from there. It's Punch-Out. Dark Souls uses very basic, very straightforward melee boxing rules. Defend, then counterattack, with 2 buttons that are either light or heavy. Pretty much every encounter follows that same basic methodology. The twist is that Dark Souls moves at a very slow speed and hits very hard. That's what increases the stakes so high and ramps up the tension. To make up for how long every attack's wind-up and cooldown is, the game increases the HP that every successful hit is worth. That's why there isn't an elaborate combo system. The combat of Dark Souls trades off complexity for the depth of its cuts. Though combat still comes and goes in a matter of seconds, they feel like minutes. You really have to commit to every one of your inputs, and that is what makes it such a nerve-wracking and high-stakes contest. It's really compelling. It makes you want to try and win out-leveled fights that you shouldn't be able to. It's a far, far cry from the speed of your usual third-person hack and slash, and I have a feeling that that is why it takes so many people so long to get used to. Pretty much the whole game is devoted to just that combat. You explore scary-looking places full of scary-looking monsters who attack you with combat that plays by scary rules, and figuring out those rules feels like a huge accomplishment. The reason why Dark Souls might be so compelling, despite not being traditionally fun, is because of how satisfying it is to overcome that difficulty. Maybe that's why so many players, myself included, didn't really start enjoying themselves until giving the game a second or third shot. In a lot of respects, Dark Souls is very similar to Doom. At its core, it's a simple and repetitive framework of a combat game whose other features are just there to flavor the combat. Because there are tangible rewards to mastering that combat, it feels sharp, meaningful, and intense. It's violent and cathartic, and it's a convincing reason to master the whole game. My first playthrough took me about 60 hours, my second was about 40, and my third was under 20. Although there's a lot of level scaling going on with how Dark Souls calculates hit values, the ultimate outcome of every encounter just depends on when you decide to defend and attack. Your character is never going to swing faster, and all of the stats that you level up through don't actually matter that much. It's not your character leveling up, it's you. Despite being so twitchy and real-time, Dark Souls also has an RPG system, and the way it works is a lot more unconventional than the way it looks. Though it is important for progressing through the game, the leveling, class selection, and inventory management is really there to help players come up with their own creative playstyle, rather than actually determine the outcome of their combat. It bridges the gap between those two mechanical functions of gameplay in a really interesting and kind of libertarian way. It's really hard to screw up the character progression, but the game is still designed to make you work hard to master its unforgiving combat, which is really easy to screw up. Dark Souls uses a complicated relationship between those RPG stats and the real-time combat to allow all players of all experience levels to gradually be able to work their way up to beating the game. But no matter who you are, you're still gonna feel the grit and the glory of conquering an insurmountable challenge. It's a system that is carefully balanced to allow anyone to beat the game. And I do mean anyone.
And that's it. That's the end of the game. There's no actual ending.
Let me explain. High-level weapons and spells have high-level requirements, and aiming to meet those requirements gives you a whole bunch of secondary benefits on your way there. After all, you'll be increasing damage for your low-level common weapons as well as the high-level unique ones. Leveling up also increases defenses and resistances no matter which particular stat you increase. Then again, no matter which stat you increase, your windups and cooldowns are never going to get slower or faster. You can speed up your movement, but not your attacks. You just have to get used to whatever moveset you want to settle into. And you safely can, because your damage and defense are tied more to your equipment than your character stats, and upgrading equipment is cheaper than upgrading your character. It's no coincidence that they both share the same currency. The same experience points that you use for leveling can also buy upgrade items, and that might actually give you better results than actually leveling. In most cases, the starter equipment that you begin the game with will eventually become the most powerful equipment for the end game, more so than the high requirement unique ones that you have to grind harder for. In fact, upgrading your most basic equipment is usually a much more helpful thing to do than upgrading your character. What all of that means is that no matter what kind of character you create, you're probably going to end up with something decent. You can play through Dark Souls at level 1. There are many ways to offset the requirements of that RPG system, mainly because the combat will always remain real-time and twitchy, but still notoriously difficult. If there is one reliable way to circumvent the game's difficulty, it's probably through the magic system. Dark Souls does have your usual fireballs and magic missiles, but you're almost better off by being clever and focusing on the more passive spells that are meant to supplement melee weapons. You can easily backstab pretty much everyone who can be backstabbed by using Aural Decoy. Or you can use Cast Light for dark areas rather than taking up a weapon slot with the lantern. Most of those spells have low-level requirements. The pyromancies have no stat requirements at all. Magic is also recharged D&D style on rest, rather than through a magic point meter. You refill and recharge almost all of your supplies at no extra cost every time you rest, and you have a lot of potential tricks up your sleeve, so the game is encouraging you to go through them all and be as crafty and clever as you can on your way to the next rest stop, or else you die. And, in the classic action game dismissal of the literal definition of death, player deaths are a surprisingly forgiving concept considering the game's first impressions. There's a lot of counterbalancing forces at play that encourage the player towards strategies that reduce the consequences of death, like how the retrievals encourage you to progress through the game slowly, bit by bit, or like how you can't bank collected souls and have to spend them on improving your character or face losing them, or like how your inventory is permanent so there's no consequences to making a suicide run for a heavily guarded item. In a lot of really subtle, clever, and almost contradictory ways, Dark Souls has low requirements for high-level play. It gives the players a lot of tools to make the best of its hard combat, and it encourages them to experiment and figure out what works best while settling into their own unique playstyle. So what we have here are open-ended RPG systems and combat mechanics that encourage the player to be crafty, and not to rely on cheap gimmicks to overcome great difficulty. It doesn't want you sniping enemies from far away or chugging down healing items in the middle of combat. It wants you to get close and put yourself at risk to slug through the combat and feel good about coming out the other side. Dark Souls wants you, no matter who or what you are, to try your hardest and succeed. And one of the most surprising ways that it sticks to that theme is by using it in the story as well as the gameplay. Like the combat, the story is difficult to consume. It's stripped down to the necessities, it's foreboding and hopeless, and it makes you work to understand what's going on. And much like the gameplay, you'll probably need to rely on outside help to figure it out. And that's because Dark Souls doesn't really explain the causes and effects behind the events in its lore. Well, it doesn't explain them clearly. After launching the game, you get a brief prologue cutscene explaining the creation myth and some lore. In the Dark Souls universe, the prehistoric world was just trees and darkness, then dragons, then humans, then a battle between dragons and humans, and then fire and brightness, but we're also told that eventually the fire will fade and that darkness will consume everything. And then it's just you, in a prison cell, with a corpse dumped overhead. And for the rest of the game, no one really explains why there was a battle with the dragons, where the dragons came from, where the fire came from, why the darkness is bad, or how everyone manages to sleep at night if darkness is bad, or if night even happens if there can't be darkness. The two different endings just reaffirm the hopeless conclusion from the prologue. You can either kindle the first flame with yourself and keep the fire going a bit longer before the inevitable darkness, or you can choose to speed up the darkening and begin the Age of Man as opposed to the Age of Fire. Who comes up with these names anyway? Anyways, in the DLC, when you explore the abyss of Ulasil, it looks like the actual problem people are having isn't stubbing their toes in the dark, but rather that the dark spreads an infestation of these giant insect parasites that turn people into zombies. And speaking of zombies, the reason the undead exist is because some people in the crazy Dark Souls universe have the curse of the undead, which causes them to respawn at bonfires after death. They still retain their memories and pretty much look normal, so then why is it a curse? Being able to just reappear after death sounds like the opposite of a curse. I guess the catch is that unless you keep a steady supply of humanity going, you do eventually go insane and start to look like a zombie, but then you're allowed to die permanently. So what's the catch? And also, since you technically are in some kind of afterlife, then how do you know that the stuff you're seeing is the same stuff that living people are seeing? So much of what you explore is hellfire and brimstone and purgatory, but the intro talks about the living people rounding up the undead people and sending them to the asylum. So why aren't there living people guarding the asylum instead of the crazy supernatural demon monsters? Do the living see the same demons that you do? As you play the game and explore, you steadily discover the most likely answer to that question. Everyone who isn't undead is probably just regular dead by now. It's hard to tell exactly what you are, where you are, and when you are, because the game kinda writes itself around a crutch of non-continuity. After all, time in Lordran is convoluted.
The flow of time itself is convoluted.
I don't know if this stuff has an explanation or not, but the game sticks with it. It presents the ambiguity of its world and it flaunts it in the very first cutscene. Did you ever notice how every item of loot you find in this game is either dropped from an enemy, found in a treasure chest, or on a corpse? Nothing is lying around by itself. And this is not a technical or design limitation. Neither of those explanations would justify the very first cutscene of the game. Your second time through, you might notice that the person dumping the corpse isn't a living guard. It's Oscar, an undead knight who you meet up with later. You might also notice that the corpse had the key to your specific cell on it. Oscar was trying to rescue you, but for some reason, Oscar can't just throw you the key down by itself. There's rules that the characters of Dark Souls have to follow. Items have to be either attached to a body or inside a box. I don't know why that's the case. I don't know if anyone knows why. It's another weird bit of lore that the game strictly follows throughout the whole experience. The undead can't interact with items that aren't attached to a body or inside a chest, which would then mean that chests are some kind of protection against that particular problem of being undead. You might think that the friendly NPCs might be able to explain what's going on here, but they don't. Instead, they just give you sinister threats and maniacal laughter. Everyone in Dark Souls is at least a little bit crazy. None of these characters deliver an easy exposition dump, and they barely qualify as characters at all. The stuff they say isn't just vague, it's often nonsensical.
Did I not explain the urgency of our tasks? Or are you so uncouth as to lack such judgment?
She's just looking at a wall. But they're still characters. They still have arcs with beginnings, middles, and ends. They interact with each other, they get in trouble, and sometimes they need rescuing. But in keeping with the game's theme, they are hopeless. There is no good, happy ending to Dark Souls, so there are no good, happy endings for the supporting characters. Because of the way their subplots are organized, you can't save everyone. And even if you do save someone, they might not be grateful about it.
Forgive me. I am impure. My tongue never intended for restoration. Please, if you have any heart, leave me be. I wish not to speak.
So it's a game that uses inevitable player failures, tragic character-driven subplots, and a convoluted sense of time that encourages multiple playthroughs to tell a story about the inevitable end of a surreal fantasy world. And that reminds me a whole lot of another game. Majora's Mask. Even if the thematic similarities between these two games are a bit loose, some of the visual inspiration is unmistakable. The giant blacksmith, the giant skeletons, and the hollow thieves all look like alternate world counterparts to characters from Majora's Mask. And take a look at Pinwheel for another example. Because of the significance of the masks and also the theme of death bringing a family together, Pinwheel would fit right into a Majora's Mask side quest. And just like the Poe sisters from Ocarina, he splits himself into decoys and you can tell which one is the real one because he does a little spin animation. Some of the music in Dark Souls also sounds like iterations on themes from the Nintendo 64 Zelda games. And just like Majora's Mask, Dark Souls rides a line between Western and Eastern visual influences. It goes from the generic D&D castles and courtyards to alien landscapes full of weirdness. One more thing it shares with Zelda is that it encourages fan storytelling. Not just fan theories, but fan storytelling. That's why the game is so vague about its exposition. The explanations are in there, but it's up to a collective effort of the fans to discover it and tell those stories to each other. You can find the details in the subtleties, but only the most dedicated fans will be able to picture together the whole story, and it's up to them to pass that along. The game's style is to present more questions than it does answers, so it's awfully lucky that it got as popular as it did because that means that people are eager to try and answer those questions. I don't think that the developers intended to create an industry of internet bards who retell their speculative stories with poetic flourish, but that's what happened. And hey, it works. If the game didn't make a demand for this kind of media, then people wouldn't be watching it. And that's why I think Dark Souls wasn't designed with an old school mindset. The difficulty of this game was incorporated into the story, gameplay, and fan communities in a way that old school games couldn't manage. Environmental storytelling is a pretty recent tool that is fairly unique to gaming, but as far as I know, doing it in this kind of way that merges canon with fanon is unique to just Dark Souls. This game wouldn't really be complete if the internet wasn't around, not just because of the multiplayer, but because of the incredibly cryptic processes required to understand how the game works and why. Take the Darkmoon Blade Covenant, for example. You grab a ring with an unimpressive stat bonus in the bottom of an optional tomb on one side of the world map, and wearing that ring makes a statue disappear in an optional area on the other side of the world map. And there are no clues guiding you on how to do this. Honestly, the only way I could ever see people figuring this out is by someone stumbling across it on accident, and then passing that information on to other players. And what's funny is that even the old school games people compare Dark Souls to were not this cryptic. Seriously, go back and play Zelda 2. It's probably not as bad as you remember it. It doesn't have elaborate blocks like this. You can see this same kind of puzzle design kind of backfire in the case of Simon's Quest. Back then it was a ploy to sell strategy guides, but when Dark Souls does the same thing, it's a ploy to get fans talking to one another and cooperating with one another instead. For the Covenants in particular, there are no in-game descriptions of what they actually do. You're totally in the dark with a lot of variables to experiment with. Their benefits are incredibly specific and opportunistic. That's something that feels like it could have either been a design oversight or a deliberate push to get players sharing information with one another. For some reason, I'm a lot more comfortable with the second answer. But implementing such a secretive nature for unlocking those player versus player factions might not actually be working in the game's favor. Using up the in-game items that activate multiplayer allows you to lessen the game's difficulty by engaging in jolly cooperation, but it also puts you at risk for getting invaded and having to play competitive multiplayer. And I don't know if it's just me, but invasions are usually a very one-sided fight. Since it takes so many deliberate and convoluted steps to discover the covenants that enable invaders to invade, they probably will always have a lot more specializations for PvP than whoever they're invading. Or they'll be a cheater. The playing field isn't really leveled by difficulty or skill there. It's offset by the complexity of uncovering the game's secrets and knowing how to build a better PvP character. And though the invasions are my least favorite feature of Dark Souls, they still serve an important purpose and have their place. The game would be less without them. The underlying philosophical theme of Dark Souls is reinforced in nearly every element of the game, including those invasions. They're part of the limbo. They're part of the game's uneasy juxtaposition between a lonely, isolating experience and also a bustling and noisy community experience. The content of Dark Souls features an abandoned and cryptic world populated by unfriendly NPCs, and only the most speculative and archaeological kind of environmental storytelling out there. But Dark Souls as a product is brimming with life. The human element of the game brings unpredictability, joy, terror, humor, and conflict to what would otherwise be an unremarkably repetitive single-player experience. And it's important to remember that Dark Souls does have a sense of humor. You can find it in the design of Sin's Fortress, or in the bloodstains, or the wood carvings. It pokes fun of how expendable the game treats life, or how confident the player might feel after overcoming only a speck of its challenges. Dark Souls is not old-fashioned, it's cutting-edge. You need a global high-speed console gaming internet infrastructure for this game to work, and yet it also exists in a post-troll world where communication was deliberately limited to make other players appear friendlier.
Very good.
Or not. This game is really designed to juggle the player between incentivizing extreme social interaction for some sections and extreme isolation for others. In Dark Souls, humanity is an in-game resource that is very finite and uncommon. After consuming one, you forever lose that one on death. You use it to activate one of the game's most important, helpful, and unique features, the multiplayer. And for one boss in particular, it seems almost necessary to bring another human player along. One other way around the scarcity of humanity is by invading other players. If you win the PvP combat, you get humanity, but you only have about 10 chances to do this unless you join a PvP covenant. You can also help other players defeat bosses for humanity, but either way, the scarcity of humanity is reinforced by the danger that the invasions present. You can't be helped by other players without putting yourself at risk to be hurt by other players. For 2 of the PvP covenants, there is no risk to losing an invasion. There's no reason not to invade. The economy of Dark Souls circulates one of its more precious and uncommon resources between multiple players' playthroughs. In practice, it forces players to think about how willing they are to help and hurt each other at the cost of each other's resources. It is a brutal system, but it should feel awfully familiar.
Coveting thy neighbor is only human, after all.
Even if you do just play Dark Souls offline, it's probably still going to be some kind of a multiplayer experience. You can't really be expected to do it all by yourself. Between looking up story explanations, covenant guides, and even weapon upgrade charts, there are things in this game that one person alone just cannot be reasonably expected to handle. The game's difficulty is brutal, but it can be overcome well enough through sheer experience and dedication, by any type of character who's willing to give it some time. The game wants you to think that it's both harder and more accommodating than it actually is. You can't get out of the fights it forces you into, but you can master their nuances. Bosses look tough, but they all have their weaknesses, but you may never find them unless you try new and scary things, or unless you bring a friend along to help. In which case there's not much to lose. Bosses don't drop less loot if there were more players involved. Most of the gameplay elements are about combat and inflicting harm on others, but a lot of them are also about healing and cooperating with others. A lot of it is about managing how to react to your own deaths, how to react to other players' deaths, and how to help them overcome those deaths. The story looks and feels hopeless. A fatalistic theme runs under every inch of it, stressing the eventual end of all things. The only goal your character is questing for is the timeliness of the inevitable end of the universe, which will come soon, no matter which ending you choose or who you save along the way. But the story doesn't just exist inside the game and its lore, it bleeds outside of it into the stories of real people in a real world full of people who will all inevitably die at some point. There's hopelessness and brutality to be found in the world of Dark Souls. It's the kind of hopelessness and brutality that it shares with our own. But like our own world, there is always a way to make the best of it. Learning how to do that is its own reward. Dark Souls is a game about uncovering secrets and overcoming hardships, and its biggest secret is that underneath all the darkness, suffering, and death of this game is an incredibly positive and uplifting message about player achievement. By exploring so many trials, tribulations, suffering, and inhumanity, Dark Souls is a test of the player's own humanity. It tests your ability to persevere in the face of hopelessness, your ability to cooperate with others and overcome it together. It tests your temptation to hurt others and to help others. It tests just how willing you are to try absolutely everything by yourself, and it shows you why that won't work. Dark Souls wants you, no matter who or what you are, to try your hardest and to succeed.